The heat was a physical thing. It wasn't just in the air, it was in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very marrow of my bones. My apartment, usually a sanctuary of cool grays and quiet solitude, had become a pressure cooker. The air was thick enough to chew, clinging to my skin like a second, sweat-soaked layer. For 3 days, the city had been suffocating under a heat wave that had shattered records and frayed nerves. My own ancient, rumbling air conditioning unit was fighting a losing battle, but it was fighting nonetheless, and for that, I was grateful. It was my only ally against the oppressive stillness. My life was built on stillness. I worked from home as a graphic designer, my world largely contained within the 4 walls of my apartment and the glowing rectangle of my monitor. It was a life I had curated, a quiet, orderly existence that kept the messiness of the world at a safe distance. Loneliness was a familiar tenant, one who paid his rent on time and rarely made a fuss. I had learned to live with him, to find a strange comfort in his predictable presence. Then there was Julian. He lived in the apartment next door, 2B. He was the antithesis of my quiet life. He was noise and motion, sawdust and the low thrum of a power sander. He was a carpenter, a freelance craftsman who seemed to build the world with his bare hands. I knew this mostly from observation. I'd see him coming and going, carrying planks of wood over a broad shoulder, his t-shirts often dusted with a fine layer of pale powder. He smelled of cedar and something sharp and citrusy, a scent that sometimes drifted through my open window on a breeze and made me stop what I was doing, just for a second. I had watched him for the better part of a year, my observations a secret, one-sided intimacy. I knew the way his dark hair curled at the nape of his neck when it was humid. I knew the specific cadence of his footsteps in the hallway. I knew the low, rumbling sound of his voice when he talked on the phone on his small balcony, a voice that seemed to vibrate through the shared wall between us. He was a constant, tangible presence just beyond my own carefully constructed isolation, a living, breathing reminder of a world I watched but rarely participated in. Our interactions were limited to brief nods in the hallway, a mumbled hey at the mailboxes. Each one left me feeling strangely electrified and foolishly adolescent. On the 4th day of the heat wave, the universe decided to shatter my predictable stillness. I was sitting at my desk, trying to focus on a color palette for a new client, when I heard it. From next door, the wheezing gasp of an old machine giving up the ghost. A metallic clank, a shudder, and then silence. A profound, damning silence that was louder than the noise it replaced. Julian's air conditioner had died. I felt a bizarre pang of sympathy, the kind you feel for a stranger in a movie. An hour passed. The sun began its slow, brutal descent, painting the sky in angry shades of orange and red, but offering no relief. The heat in my own apartment was becoming unbearable. I had abandoned my desk and was now sitting on the floor in front of a large box fan, its blades chopping the soupy air into a slightly less soupy breeze. It was the only spot in the apartment that felt remotely habitable. That's when the knock came. It was a solid, hesitant sound, not the light tap of a delivery person. I knew, with a sudden, heart-thudding certainty, who it was. My mind raced. My hair was a mess. I was wearing an old, paint-stained t-shirt and shorts, and I was pretty sure I had a sheen of sweat that was less athletic glow and more drowning victim. I considered not answering. I could pretend I was out or asleep. But the quiet desperation in that knock, followed by a second, slightly more urgent one, propelled me to my feet. I opened the door a crack. Julian stood there, looking just as wrecked by the heat as I felt. His dark t-shirt was damp, clinging to his chest and shoulders. His face was flushed, and his hair was sticking to his forehead. He looked tired and frustrated, and, even in his disheveled state, impossibly handsome. "Hey," he said, his voice a little rough. "Sorry to bother you." "No problem," I managed, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. He ran a hand through his damp hair, a gesture of pure exasperation. "My AC just died. It's like an oven in there. I was wondering, this is going to sound weird, but is yours working?" He gestured vaguely toward my living room, from which the whir of my fan was an audible promise of relief. "Barely," I said, opening the door wider. "But it's something. The fan is the real hero right now." He gave a small, grateful smile that made the corner of his eyes crinkle. It was the first time he'd ever smiled directly at me, and it felt like a physical impact. Any chance a desperate neighbor could borrow a few square feet of fan-adjacent real estate? I'll buy you a beer. A whole case. When the world stops melting. My brain, which usually supplied me with witty retorts and clever observations for my internal monologue, offered up a single, unhelpful word. Yes. Of course, I said, stepping back. Come in. He slipped past me into the apartment, and the space, which had always felt perfectly sized for one, suddenly felt small, charged with his presence. He brought the heat in with him, but he also brought that scent of cedar and citrus, now mingled with the salty tang of sweat. It was overwhelmingly real. I closed the door, feeling like I had just locked a wolf in a chicken coop, and I was definitely the chicken. He walked toward the fan and stood in the path of the artificial breeze, closing his eyes for a moment in sheer bliss. Oh man, that's incredible. I hovered awkwardly by the door, unsure of the protocol for entertaining a man you've been secretly observing for a year. Do I offer him a drink? A towel? A lifetime of devotion? I've got water, I said, the words tumbling out. Or iced tea. Water would be amazing, he said, not opening his eyes. He was soaking up the air from the fan like a man who'd been wandering the desert. I retreated to the kitchen, my hands trembling slightly as I filled a glass from the pitcher in the fridge. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm. He's in your apartment. Julian is in your apartment. I took a deep, steadying breath, trying to get a grip. It was just a neighbor. A hot, sweaty, incredibly attractive neighbor who was currently standing in his socks in my living room. Totally normal. When I returned, he had opened his eyes and was looking around. My apartment was a reflection of me, neat, ordered, and impersonal. A few carefully chosen art prints on the walls, a bookshelf organized by color, a distinct lack of personal photographs. It was a space designed to be looked at, not lived in. Nice place, he said, taking the glass from me. Our fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. It was nothing. It was everything. A jolt of electricity shot up my arm, a startling, vivid spark in the humid air. I pulled my hand back as if I'd touched a hot stove. I wasn't sure if he'd felt it, or if he'd even noticed. His expression was unreadable as he took a long drink of the water. Thanks, I mumbled, my gaze fixed on the floor. He finished the water in a few deep swallows and set the empty glass on my coffee table. He turned back to the fan, and I, not knowing what else to do, drifted back to my spot on the floor, a few feet away from him. We stood there in silence for a moment, the only sound the rhythmic whirring of the fan blades. It was awkward. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the strangeness of our sudden proximity. I risked a glance at him. He was staring straight ahead, his profile outlined against the dimming light from the window. The line of his jaw was sharp, his throat strong as he swallowed. I could see the pulse beating steadily in his neck. My own pulse was a frantic mess. This was too much. He was too close. The carefully constructed wall between my life and his had crumbled, and he was standing right in the middle of the rubble. I must have been staring, because he turned his head and met my gaze. His eyes were a dark, warm brown, and they held mine for a beat too long. I felt my face flush, a wave of heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I looked away, embarrassed. Sorry, he said, his voice low. I'm invading your space. No, it's fine, I insisted, probably too quickly. It's really hot, a brilliant observation. I was a master of scintillating conversation. He chuckled, a low, pleasant sound. Yeah, that's one word for it. He shifted his weight, and I became acutely aware of the distance between us. Maybe 3 feet. It felt like a mile. It felt like a millimeter. He took a small step, then another, closing the gap until he was standing just beside me. My breath hitched in my throat. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a furnace of his own. I was frozen, every muscle in my body tensed. My mind was screaming at me to say something, to do something, to break the spell. But I couldn't move. I could only feel the overwhelming fact of his closeness. He must have sensed my tension. He glanced down at me, a slight, almost imperceptible frown touching his lips. He looked at the space between us, then back at my face. Is this okay? He asked, his voice soft, questioning. I'm hogging the fan. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. It's fine. He didn't move away. Instead, he seemed to lean in ever so slightly, his shoulder almost brushing mine. The air from the fan washed over us, a shared current that did little to cool the sudden, intense heat building between us. He was watching me, his gaze steady and searching, as if he was trying to read the answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. And then he said it. The words were quiet, a low murmur that was almost lost in the sound of the fan, but they landed in my chest with the force of a physical blow. Closer's fine. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an invitation, an absolution. My mind went completely blank. All the anxieties, all the overthinking, all the carefully constructed barriers I had built around myself just dissolved. There was only the heat, the sound of the fan, and Julian, standing so close I could feel his breath on my skin. Closer's fine. My heart was a runaway train. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. This is it. This is the moment where you either step forward or you retreat back into your quiet, safe, lonely life. For a year, I had been a spectator. He was offering me a place on the stage. I took a breath, and I took a step. The distance between us vanished. Our arms brushed, from shoulder to elbow. The contact was electric, a current that ran through my entire body. I could feel the solid muscle of his arm against mine, the radiating warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of our shirts. He didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned into the touch, a subtle shift of weight that anchored him against me. We stood there, side by side, our bodies touching, sharing the same small pocket of moving air. The rest of the world, the oppressive heat, the silent apartment, it all faded away. There was only this terrifying, exhilarating, impossible closeness. I tilted my head back slightly, my eyes fluttering shut, and just breathed. The air that touched my face had first passed over him, and it carried his scent, that mix of cedar and citrus and warm skin. It was intoxicating. Time seemed to stretch and warp. A minute could have been an hour. I was aware of every tiny detail, the soft sound of his breathing, the slight tremor in my own hands, the way the muscles in his arm tensed and relaxed against mine. He was so incredibly solid, so real. A stark contrast to the ghosts of connection I usually entertained in my own head. He finally broke the silence, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through his body and into mine. Better. I wasn't sure if he was talking about the heat or something else entirely. I couldn't find my voice to answer, so I just nodded, a small, jerky movement. He shifted again, turning his body slightly toward me. I opened my eyes. He was looking down at me, his expression one of intense focus. The playful, frustrated neighbor from the hallway was gone. In his place was someone else, someone I didn't know, but felt like I had been waiting for my entire life. His gaze dropped to my lips for a fraction of a second, and my breath caught in my chest. This was happening. This was actually happening. But the moment, as perfect and fragile as it was destined to be broken. From the street below, a car horn blared, a long, angry sound that shattered the quiet intimacy of the room. It was like a splash of cold water. I flinched, pulling back slightly, the spell broken. The distance returned, a chasm of a few inches that felt wider than before. Julian blinked, as if coming out of a trance. He cleared his throat and took a half-step back, running a hand over his face. The easy confidence he usually wore seemed to have deserted him. He looked uncertain. I should probably, he started, gesturing vaguely toward the door. Let you have your space back. No, it's okay, I said, the words rushing out. I didn't want him to go. Not now. Stay? Please. It's too hot in your place. He looked at me, his brown eyes searching my face. I tried to keep my expression neutral, to not betray the desperate yearning I felt inside. Please don't go. Please don't let this be another near miss in a life full of them. He gave a slow nod. Okay. For a little while. The tension eased, but it didn't disappear. It had changed, morphed into something new. A shared secret. A question hanging in the air between us. We migrated from the fan to my small sofa, sinking into the cushions at opposite ends. The fan, now oscillating, swept its breeze over us in rhythmic waves. For a long time, we didn't speak. We just sat, listening to the fan and the distant sounds of the city. I spent the next hour engaged in my favorite pastime, overthinking. I replayed the moment by the fan again and again in my mind. Closer's fine. The way he'd said it. The way he'd looked at me. The feel of his arm against mine. It couldn't have been my imagination. The intensity, the charge in the air, it was real. But now, sitting 3 feet apart on the couch, it felt like a dream I was waking up from. Maybe I had misread everything. Maybe he was just being friendly, trying to make an awkward situation less so. My mind was a battlefield of hope and doubt. Julian, for his part, seemed lost in his own thoughts. He leaned his head back against the sofa, his eyes closed. I watched the steady rise and fall of his chest. He looked exhausted. The heat was draining enough, but I wondered what else was weighing on him. I wanted to ask. I wanted to know everything about him. What made him laugh? What kept him up at night? Did he ever feel the same crushing loneliness that was my constant companion? The silence stretched, becoming less awkward and more companionable. The initial shock of his presence had worn off, replaced by a quiet hum of awareness. It was strangely domestic, the two of us sharing a room in the fading light. It felt nice. It felt like something I could get used to. Eventually, he spoke, his voice soft in the quiet room. "So, you're a graphic designer?" I was startled by the question. "Yeah. How did you know?" He opened his eyes and turned his head to look at me. A small smile played on his lips. "I see the light from your monitor under your door at all hours. Figured you were either a designer, a writer, or a very dedicated insomniac." I felt a blush creep up my neck. He'd noticed. He'd paid attention to the small details of my life, just as I had to his. Guilty on all 3 counts, sometimes, I admitted, a genuine smile touching my own lips for the first time. "What kind of stuff do you design?" he asked, his interest seeming genuine. And so I told him. I talked about logos and branding, about the frustrating satisfaction of finding the perfect font, about the clients who knew exactly what they wanted and the ones who had no idea. He listened intently, nodding and asking questions. It was easy. The words flowed out of me, unchecked by my usual self-consciousness. Then I asked him about his work. His face lit up as he talked about the grain of different woods, about the challenge of a difficult joint, about the simple, profound joy of creating something beautiful and functional with his hands. He spoke with a passion and a certainty that I envied. He knew his place in the world. He built it. We talked for what must have been hours. The sun went down, plunging the apartment into a deep twilight, but neither of us moved to turn on a light. We talked about the city, about bad movies, about the best place to get pizza in the neighborhood. It was the longest conversation I'd had with anyone in months, and it felt as essential as breathing. At some point, the power grid, pushed beyond its limits, finally gave out. The fan sputtered and died. The low hum of the refrigerator ceased. The entire building was plunged into an abrupt, profound darkness and silence. We both fell silent, the sudden absence of noise amplifying the intimacy of the dark room. "Well," Julian said, his voice a low, close sound in the blackness. "I guess that solves the problem of who gets the fan." I let out a nervous laugh. "Now we can both melt in equal misery." "Misery loves company," he said. I could hear the smile in his voice. The darkness changed things. It stripped away the pretense, the need to watch our expressions, to monitor our body language. There was only the sound of our voices, our breathing, in the oppressive, silent heat. "You know," he said after a moment, his tone shifting, becoming more serious. "My last relationship ended because he said I was unreadable, too quiet. He said he never knew what I was thinking." The confession hung in the dark air between us. It was an offering, a piece of his history, of his vulnerability. My heart ached for him, and for the man who couldn't see what was so clear to me. Julian wasn't unreadable. You just had to know how to watch. You had to pay attention to the small things, the way his hands moved when he was excited, the slight frown of concentration when he was working, the warmth that filled his eyes when he talked about something he loved. "He was wrong," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. My voice was firm, certain. There was a long pause. I could hear him shift on the couch, the sound of fabric rustling. He was closer now. I could feel it. "How do you know?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I've been studying you for a year," I thought. "Because I see you." "I just do," I said instead. I felt his hand then. It found mine in the darkness, his fingers gently closing around my own. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip both strong and tentative. It was the most deliberate, unambiguous touch yet. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a brush in the hallway. It was a choice. He laced his fingers through mine. And in the hot, silent darkness of my apartment, I felt like I had finally come home. We sat like that for a long time, hands intertwined on the space between us on the sofa, not speaking. The darkness was a blanket, a safe space where we could just be. The heat was still there, a constant pressure, but it no longer felt oppressive. It was just a part of the moment, a part of the warmth that was blooming in my chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. My mind, for once, was quiet. The constant chatter of anxiety and self-doubt had been silenced. There was only the solid, reassuring weight of his hand in mine, the sound of his breathing, the shared reality of our presence in the dark. It was a simple, profound peace. I had spent so much of my life feeling like I was on the outside looking in, a ghost haunting the edges of my own existence. But holding Julian's hand, I felt anchored. I felt real. Eventually, the first flicker of light appeared. Someone across the street had found candles. It cast long, dancing shadows into my apartment, providing just enough light to see his silhouette. He was closer than I'd realized, his shoulder only inches from mine. He turned his head, and even in the dim, flickering light, I could see he was watching me. "I have candles," I said, my voice a little hoarse. "In the kitchen." "Stay," he said, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. The simple command sent a shiver through me. "I'll get them." He let go of my hand, and I felt an immediate, irrational sense of loss. He moved with a quiet confidence through the unfamiliar layout of my apartment, his shadow large and protective on the wall. I heard the sound of a drawer opening, the rustle of a box. A moment later, a small, brave flame flickered to life in the kitchen, and he returned, carrying a single white candle on a saucer. He placed it on the coffee table. The candlelight was soft, intimate. It illuminated his face, casting a warm glow on his strong features and making his eyes seem even darker, deeper. The world shrank to the small, golden circle of light around us. He sat back down on the sofa, closer this time. Our knees were touching. He didn't take my hand again, but the connection was still there, a tangible thing in the air between us. "I should have done this sooner," he said, his gaze fixed on the candle flame. "Done what?" I asked, my heart starting to pick up its frantic rhythm again. "This," he looked at me then, his expression open and vulnerable. "Knocked on your door? Talked to you. I've wanted to. For a long time." The admission hit me with the force of a tidal wave. All this time, I had thought my observation was a one-way street. I had been so wrapped up in my own yearning, my own fears, that I had never considered he might have been looking back. I didn't know," I stammered. "How could you?" He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. "I'm not exactly the best at this stuff. I build things. I'm good with my hands. Words are harder." "You're doing okay so far," I said, a genuine smile spreading across my face. He let out a soft laugh, the sound warm and rich in the quiet room. "Leo," he said, and the sound of my name on his lips, the first time he'd ever said it, was both startling and incredibly right. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." He paused, his gaze dropping to my mouth again, just for a second. The air crackled. The heat in the room intensified, coiling low in my stomach. When we were standing by the fan, he began, his voice dropping even lower. "What were you thinking?" The question was direct, leaving me nowhere to hide. I could lie. I could deflect. I could make a joke. But looking at his face, at the honest vulnerability in his eyes, I knew I couldn't. This moment was too important, too real, to be tainted by fear. I took a deep breath. "I was thinking," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "that I didn't want you to move away." A slow smile spread across his face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "Good," he breathed, "because I was thinking about this." He leaned in. It was slow, deliberate, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I didn't move. I couldn't have, even if I'd wanted to. I met him halfway, my eyes fluttering shut as his lips met mine. The kiss was not what I had expected. I had imagined something desperate, frantic, a release of all the pent-up tension. But it wasn't like that at all. It was soft. It was gentle. It was a question and an answer all at once. His lips were warm and firm, and he tasted of the water I'd given him and something else, something that was just. "Julian." He pulled back a fraction of an inch, his forehead resting against mine. His hand came up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. The calloused skin was a pleasant, grounding friction against my own. "Okay," he whispered, his breath warm on my lips. "More than okay," I breathed back. He kissed me again, deeper this time. It was still gentle, but there was a new urgency to it, a confirmation of everything that had been unsaid between us for so long. My hands, which had been frozen at my sides, came up to rest on his chest. I could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart under my palm, a rhythm that seemed to sync with my own. It was a kiss that felt like an ending and a beginning. The end of a year of silent observation, of lonely nights and quiet yearning, and the beginning of something else, something real, something terrifying and wonderful. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. The candle flame danced and swayed, casting our shadows on the wall behind us. He didn't move away. He just stayed there, his forehead pressed to mine, his hand still cradling my face. "Your place is still an oven," I murmured, a silly, giddy laugh bubbling up inside me. "I'm not going back there tonight," he said, his voice a low, definite rumble. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that I didn't want him to. The night passed in a surreal, dreamlike state. The power stayed off, and we didn't care. We talked more, our voices low whispers in the candlelight. We shared stories from our childhoods, our pasts, filling in the gaps that my one-sided observations had left empty. He told me about growing up in a small town, about learning carpentry from his grandfather. I told him about my quiet, bookish youth, about my decision to pursue a career that allowed for solitude. With every word, the image I had built of him in my head was replaced by the far more complex, interesting, and wonderful reality of the man himself. And I found myself falling for him all over again, not for the idea of him, but for the real, solid person sitting beside me. Eventually, the candle burned low, and an exhausted, bone-deep weariness set in. My bedroom, with its one large window, was the coolest room in the apartment. Without discussion, we ended up there. There was a moment of awkwardness at the door, a silent question of what, exactly, this meant. "I just want to sleep next to you," he said, seeming to read my mind. "Is that okay?" It was more than okay. It was everything I had secretly wished for. We stripped down to our shorts in the near darkness, the movements economical and devoid of any overt seduction. It was about comfort, about shedding the sweaty layers of the day. The act itself was intimate, a quiet acceptance of each other's presence in this vulnerable state. The bed was a queen, but it felt enormous. I lay on one side, he on the other, a wide expanse of sheet between us. The heat was still thick, and we lay on top of the covers. For a few minutes, we were silent, two separate figures in the dark. The anxiety, which had been so beautifully absent, began to creep back in. Was this a mistake? Was it too soon? Then, I felt the bed shift as he rolled onto his side, facing me. "Leo," he whispered. "Yeah. Come here." I rolled over to face him. The space between us was now only a few inches. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, I could just make out the shape of his face, the dark slash of his eyebrows, the glint in his eyes. He reached out, his hand settling on my waist, and gently pulled me closer until my chest was flush against his. He tucked my head under his chin, his arm wrapping securely around me. My arm found its way around his waist, my hand resting on the warm, solid expanse of his back. He smelled of candle wax and sweat, and that wonderful cedar citrus scent that was uniquely him. I could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart against my ear. "Better," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against my skull. And it was. All the anxiety, all the fear, melted away in his arms. I felt safe. I felt seen. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of his breathing, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel alone. I fell asleep in his arms, the oppressive heat of the city forgotten, replaced by a different kind of warmth, one that came from the inside out. I woke slowly, drifting up from a deep, dreamless sleep. My first conscious thought was that I was cool. Not cold, but comfortable. The oppressive blanket of heat was gone. My second thought was that I was not alone. A heavy, warm arm was slung over my waist, and a solid body was pressed against my back. The slow, Even breathing, I'd fallen asleep to was still there, a soft puff of air against my neck. Julian. It all came rushing back. The dead air conditioner, the knock on the door, the fan, the kiss, the confession. It hadn't been a dream. I lay perfectly still, my eyes still closed, afraid to move and break the spell. The room was filled with the gray light of early morning. I could hear the distant, familiar sounds of the city waking up, and I could hear the low, steady hum of my air conditioner. The power was back on. A sudden, cold wave of anxiety washed over me. The magic of the blackout was gone, replaced by the harsh light of a new day. Last night, in the dark, everything had felt so simple, so right. But now there were consequences. Awkwardness. Regret. What if he regretted it? What if, in the light of day, he saw me not as a romantic figure, but as his lonely, weird neighbor? What if this was just a heat-induced, temporary lapse in judgment? The silence of my mind from the night before was gone, replaced by the familiar, frantic chorus of overthinking. I held my breath, listening to his. It was still deep and even. He was asleep. I had to get out of this bed before he woke up. I needed space to think, to process, to prepare myself for the inevitable awkward conversation. Carefully, inch by agonizing inch, I began to disentangle myself. I lifted his arm from my waist, my movements slow and deliberate. The warmth of his skin lingered on my shirt. I slid toward the edge of the bed, my heart pounding with every tiny creak of the mattress. I was almost free. My feet touched the cool wood of the floor. I was halfway to a standing position when his voice, thick with sleep, cut through the quiet room. Don't go. I froze, my body tensed. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just stared at the wall, my back to him. I was just going to make coffee. I lied, my voice sounding strained and unnatural. I heard the rustle of sheets as he sat up. The silence stretched for a long, agonizing moment. I was convinced he was about to say it. Look, about last night. I braced myself for the impact. Leo, he said, his voice closer now. He was right behind me. Turn around. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, then took a deep breath and did as he asked. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his hair a mess, his face soft with sleep. He wasn't wearing a shirt. In the chaos of the night, I hadn't even noticed. My eyes took in the broad expanse of his chest, the dusting of dark hair, the strong lines of his shoulders. He was beautiful, and he was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Morning, he said, his voice a low rasp. Morning, I replied, my hands twisting the hem of my t-shirt. He scrubbed a hand over his face, then looked up at me again. His gaze was clear, steady. There was no regret in his eyes, only a quiet intensity. I woke up a few minutes ago, he said, and my first thought wasn't about the AC being back on. It was that I felt safe. He paused, as if the admission surprised even him. I haven't felt that way in a long time. Of all the things I had expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. The anxiety that had been choking me began to recede, replaced by a tentative, fragile hope. Me too, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. A slow smile touched his lips. He reached out and took my hand, his grip warm and firm, just as it had been in the dark. He tugged gently. Come back to bed. Coffee can wait. I let him pull me back, sitting on the edge of the mattress beside him. He didn't let go of my hand. He just held it, his thumb tracing lazy circles over my knuckles. The simple, deliberate touch was a reassurance, a confirmation that last night was real and that this morning was not an ending. So, he said after a moment of comfortable silence. What happens now? It was the question I had been dreading, but hearing it from him, in his calm, steady voice, it didn't sound so scary. It sounded hopeful. I don't know, I answered honestly. I'm not very good at this. Me neither, he confessed with a small laugh. But I'm willing to figure it out. If you are. He was looking at me, his heart in his eyes, waiting for my answer. And for the first time, the choice felt simple. There was no room for overthinking, for doubt. There was only him, and the quiet, certain feeling in my chest that this was right. I am, I said, and I meant it. He brought my hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to my knuckles. Good. We ended up making coffee together. The small, domestic act felt momentous. We moved around each other in the tight space of my kitchen, a clumsy, unpracticed dance. But it was our dance. I learned that he took his coffee black. He learned that I owned an absurd number of mismatched mugs. We sat on the sofa, the same sofa where our story had truly begun just hours before. The morning light streamed in through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The apartment was cool, quiet. The crisis of the heat wave was over. But something far more significant had taken its place. He had to go back to his own apartment eventually, to shower and get ready for a job he had. As he stood at my door, there was a moment of hesitation, the kind of awkward pause that happens when you don't yet know the rules of this new thing between you. Do you shake hands? Hug? Kiss? Julian solved the problem by leaning in and giving me a quick, firm kiss. It was chaste, simple, and it sent a jolt of warmth straight to my toes. "I'll see you later?" he asked, his hand on the doorknob. "Yeah," I said, a goofy, uncontrollable smile spreading across my face. "Later." He smiled back, that wonderful, eye-crinkling smile, and then he was gone. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart full to bursting. The apartment was quiet again, back to its usual state of stillness. But it was different. The loneliness that had been my constant companion was gone. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful, filled with the echo of his presence and the promise of his return. I walked over to the fan, still sitting in the middle of the living room. I reached down and switched it off. I didn't need it anymore. The days that followed were a study in quiet discovery. We didn't fall into a whirlwind romance. It was slower than that, more deliberate. It was dinner at my place, cooked together in my small kitchen. It was me, sitting on a stool in his workshop, a chaotic, wonderful space that smelled perpetually of sawdust, watching him work. It was him, leaning over my shoulder at my desk, genuinely interested as I explained the nuances of kerning to him. We were learning each other's rhythms, the small, intimate details that make a person whole. I learned that he hummed, a low, tuneless sound, when he was concentrating. He learned that I had to have my bookshelf perfectly organized, a quirk he found endlessly endearing. There were still moments of awkwardness, of uncertainty. We were two solitary people learning how to be a pair. Sometimes, a comfortable silence would suddenly feel charged with my own old insecurities, and I would find myself starting to withdraw into my shell. But every time, Julian would seem to sense it. He would reach out and take my hand, or make a quiet, dry joke, or simply meet my eyes across the room with a look that said, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." One evening, about a week after the heatwave had broken, we were sitting on my balcony. The air was cool and pleasant. The city lights twinkled below us. Julian was quiet, leaning back in his chair, looking out at the skyline. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, my voice soft. He was silent for a moment, then turned to me. "I'm thinking," he said, his voice thoughtful, "that I'm glad my air conditioner broke." I laughed, a real, uninhibited sound. "That's a terrible thing to be glad about." "Is it?" He reached across the small space between our chairs and took my hand. His fingers laced through mine, a familiar, comforting gesture. "It brought me here. It brought me to you." My chest felt tight, full of an emotion so big I didn't have a name for it. It was more than happiness, more than relief. It was a profound sense of rightness, of things falling into place in a way I had never allowed myself to hope for. I looked at our joined hands, at the way his calloused, capable fingers fit so perfectly with my own. I thought about the year I had spent watching him from a distance, living a half-life in the quiet of my apartment. I had been safe, but I hadn't been living. The heat wave had forced a change. It had broken down my walls, literally and figuratively. It had brought this wonderful, steady, kind man to my door. It had started with a simple, desperate need to escape the heat, and it had turned into this quiet, beautiful, real connection. I was no longer an observer in my own life. I was a participant, and it was terrifying, and it was the best thing that had ever happened to me. I squeezed his hand. "I'm glad it broke too," I said. He smiled, and in the warm glow of the city lights, I knew I was home. The stillness I had once cultivated to keep the world out had been transformed. It was no longer the silence of loneliness, but the quiet peace of a shared life just beginning. And it was a stillness I now welcomed, because he was in it with me.